What was very important, and the Mexicans have made it very clear that their summit is going to have to focus, and it's pretty clear they're going to have to focus on the consequences of the financial crisis. And I thought that the meeting dealt with it very, very well. The need for the IMF, the Financial Stability Board, to be built up, to be given the powers that they need. The need to recognize that things like development and climate change are economic issues every bit as much as social issues. I thought that what happened, as with all CIGI meetings, who are the leaders in the whole creation of the G20, I thought it went very well.
People say, well, one of the reasons why there isn't as much agreement these days is because the financial crisis has waned somewhat. This was before the current euro crisis. And therefore, there isn't, we don't have we need a crisis. Well, all I think you need to do is to sort of go underneath the surface of a couple of issues like the ocean and water to find ample cause, ample motivation and drive towards the need to reach concerted and coordinated and cooperative outcomes, which require international mechanisms and global leadership to bring them about. So I think this notion of the fact that we don't have a crisis is actually not true, is that you need to really just broaden your view a little bit of what global needs are around the world. And it's clear that oceans and water are two of them.
I cannot see a question on which the time is ripe or appropriate to try and get a G20 focus on water itself. But by doing the right thing in agriculture or in trade or on environmental issues, you will have very much of a positive impact on water. Why do I say I can't think of an issue? Because what really needs to be done in water is for the decision-making level, national leadership or regional or sub-regional leadership, to start through the processes of dialogues and examination and studies and publishing these, make their own people aware of what their water situation is and that what has to happen over time. That can be encouraged at the G20 level, but there's not likely to be a direct link from a paragraph saying this should happen down to that actually happening. This is a process that we're trying to build using a lot of organizations, a lot of World Water Partnership, the Global Water Partnership, the World Water Council, the World Environmental, the World Economic Forum. There's a lot of organizations that are realizing that the importance of water and pushing for measures such as these. It would be good to have a boost from the major senior intergovernmental level, but it's very difficult to imagine what I know of the G20 actually doing that in a fashion that would have a sequel that led on.
I'm a little bit one of those who's not sure that the right place to start is the structures or the form, if you like. This is a complex world where, whether it's migration or public health or finance or crime, to just take some of the issues which were discussed, before you can build a useful structure or institution to deal with those issues, you have to come to some kind of international agreement and expression of collective political will about what's the solution. Is the world ready to accept more open immigration? Is the world willing to accept a particular combination of civil liberties and crime prevention as a global strategy for dealing with this? And that's really the difficulty. We're a world where the old Western-driven consensus on public policy issues is breaking up as new views come to the table, and we've got to kind of get our arms around that before we start sort of plugging the holes with a new institution here or there. We need the political will and the agreement on how to address the problems first.
Yes, well, for nuclear energy, it's rather problematic because a number of states, as is widely known, are seeking nuclear energy for the first time. So the way they do that is normally they consult the International Atomic Energy Agency on whether nuclear energy is suitable for them. And the agency has a huge list of requirements for a state to have that in a safe, secure and non-proliferation form. And it ranges from things like having a nuclear safety and security culture amongst the workforce to having finance suitable for the infrastructure that you need, to having electricity transmission wires to go from your generation plant to the customer, to have legislation in place to ensure that everything's done in a safe and secure manner, and the administrative bodies that need to flow from that. You need a regulatory agency, for instance. This is an enormous list of things for countries to do. The agency in Vienna calls it the milestones document. And in some cases, the agency briefs particularly developing countries on what they need using this milestone document, and they take fright. They realize that actually nuclear energy is not for them. But for some of them, their energy needs are so pressing, particularly in Africa, the uptake of electricity is very low. Many villages, many towns, even cities are not properly serviced with electricity. So there are huge needs. And the agency tells them, or convinces them, that nuclear energy is not for them. The question is, where do they go? What alternatives are there? There's actually no global governance body which provides advice to developing countries on the totality of their energy needs and what are the most sensible alternatives, whether it's renewables or gas or, God forbid, coal, but what is the totality of the choices that are arrayed before them, particularly if nuclear is out of the picture. Then they really have to think about alternatives. There is something called the International Energy Agency, but it's actually part of the Organization for Cooperation and Development, which is a rich countries club. It's the OECD. That is not in a good position to provide advice to developing countries. It's a tiny agency. It's mainly concerned with the needs of developed countries themselves, not developing countries. I gather there's some sort of process of networking amongst non-member states of the OECD, but that's really not entirely satisfactory. So what I think we really need is an international energy agency that is truly international, that is truly multilateral, which has members from the entire international community, developing and developed states, which can then offer states some framework to think about the totality of their energy needs. And presumably that has to be linked to climate change as well. You can't think about energy in the absence of climate change and a price on carbon and how to move from very dirty energy sources like coal to cleaner sources. So for me, that would be one of the priorities for rejigging global governance, and that's certainly be one of the themes that's come out of this CIGI'11 conference.
Well, there are two ways of looking at the G20, right? I mean, one is to focus on its mandate and its core agenda, its responsibility for the global economy and financial stability. But the other is to remember that it is the only place where the rising powers and the established powers come together as peers. And so to see the G20 broaden its focus dramatically beyond economic affairs and toward political affairs, that's not going to happen soon. But if we only keep to the economic affairs, then I think we are losing sight of that broader need for emerging powers and established powers to cooperate on the many different kinds of problems in the world.
I think this is one of the more difficult times to talk about the future, for very good reasons in the world of energy. First of all, there's a fair degree of uncertainty around economic developments, and clearly energy needs relate in part to overall GDP, income levels, and so on. I think secondly, the waxing and waning of public support for climate change, other environmental concerns, which impinge directly on the energy industry. It's not sure yet which direction we're going to move in. I think it's clear coming out of the Copenhagen summit that there are very varying views on this.
So I'd love to see, there's a kind of economic reform agenda out there fixing what's wrong with the current financial system, and there's an environmental reform out there that's being driven by climate change particularly, which is getting worse, measurably worse, and it's going to cost us more to deal with it. There are ways in which we can make these things come together, and when you want to do something sensible economically, like cut budgets, then cut these stupid subsidies. And there are some subsidies that are useful, there are lots that aren't. Agricultural prices are at historic highs. Why do farmers need subsidies? Oil companies surely don't need subsidies. That's just hogs at the trough. The estimate of the international guys is that governments spend almost $500 billion a year subsidizing fossil fuels. And the figure for agriculture in the developed countries, Canada, the United States, Japan, etc., is $400 million. That's, you know, 900, that's almost $1 trillion a year that we're taking and subsidizing. A lot of these activities are actually, we're subsidizing climate change. And we're often subsidizing highly profitable industries that don't need the subsidy. In developing countries, the developing country governments are funding, say, fuel for the poor. That's the point of the kerosene subsidy. All the studies that we and everybody else have done indicate that most of the benefits go to the rich and the middle class. They don't go to the poor at all. So you cut the subsidy on kerosene in Indonesia. Indonesia, which is a relatively poor country, was spending 35% of its entire national budget on subsidies to fossil fuels. 35%. More than health, more than education, more than defense. So what did they do? They cut it. Now, if you cut that, it's political death, because the poor do benefit to an extent. And instead of having everybody in the streets, what they did was they actually gave the poor money. They actually said, we're going to increase the price of kerosene by whatever, X cents, and we're going to give you the equivalent of money. If you're stupid, you can go and spend all this stuff on buying kerosene. But you might actually figure out, which they do because markets work, people started using less kerosene because it was more expensive, and they started taking some of this extra money and spending it on other things, sending their kids to school, buying school uniforms, etc. So you can do it. It's politically difficult. Once a subsidy is in place, it gets a huge constituency of supporters who have many, many reasons why the thing ought to be continued, some of which relate to the fact that, you know, MP X from constituency Y is going to get killed by the farmers in his constituency if he votes in favor of repealing a subsidy. But it can be done, and there's a real good opportunity to do it now that governments are feeling skint.
I think what came out of the discussion we had here over the last couple of days is there should be a real focus on the need for jobs, social inclusion, dealing with growing disparities in the world, that it's important that the message that comes out of G20 meetings address problems in the lives of real people and not seemingly be institution tinkering, which is something which the broad number of voters in any of our countries really don't understand and don't see the value of. So we've got to find a way of communicating what this is really all about. That we have in the past, I think, in G20 meetings, not done so well at.